Dr. Aris Thorne, a climatologist whose arrogance was matched only by his brilliance, saw the Arctic not as a place of terrifying beauty, but as the planet's last pristine laboratory. For 6 months, he would be the sole occupant of the Polaris North Research Station, a high-tech marvel of warmth and engineering marooned in a sea of ice. His mission? To gather atmospheric data untainted by the messy variables of civilization. As the last supply plane shrank into a gray, unforgiving sky, leaving him to the encroaching polar night, Aris felt not fear, but a profound sense of rightness. Here, there was only cold, data, and truth. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The sun was a memory. For the past week, it had been a brief, apologetic smear of pale orange on the horizon. And now it was gone entirely, surrendering the world to the deep, star-dusted dark of the polar night. Inside the Polaris North Station, however, all was light and order. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man in his 40s with a sharp mind and an even sharper jawline, moved with the quiet confidence of a king in his castle. The station was a marvel, a central living module connected by reinforced corridors to 3 smaller pods, engineering, atmospheric sensors, and storage. It was his world, his bubble of controlled, predictable warmth against the chaos of the outside. He savored the ritual of his solitude. The first official night of total darkness was a milestone. He brewed a cup of impossibly black coffee, the rich aroma a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of the station's life support system. The low, constant hum of the machinery, the CO2 scrubbers, the heating elements, the data servers, was the station's heartbeat, a sound he found more comforting than any symphony. He stood before the main console, a sweeping bank of monitors displaying the lifeblood of his work: wind speeds, barometric pressure, particulate counts, and a dozen other metrics flowed in a steady, calming stream. This was purity. This was science. Outside, a blizzard had begun to rage, a common occurrence. The wind howled, a sound muted by the triple-paned, reinforced plexiglass of the porthole windows. It was a tantrum of nature, but a predictable one. He had models that could forecast these storms with 98% accuracy. He respected the power of the Arctic, but he wasn't intimidated by it. It was a system, and all systems, he believed, could be understood and their variables measured. His kingdom extended beyond the station's walls via a web of technology. A grid of 300 remote sensor posts fanned out across the tundra, covering a 50-square-mile radius. Each one was a silent, dutiful soldier, reporting back every 60 seconds. Aris's gaze swept across the grid display on his main monitor, a sea of green icons, each indicating a functioning sensor. He was about to turn away, to log the official start of his solo wintering mission, when something flickered. An icon on the far northeastern edge of the grid, designated S284, flashed red. A data alert. He sighed. Probably a malfunction. The cold was brutal on electronics, no matter how well hardened. He clicked on the icon, pulling up its data stream. His brow furrowed. The alert wasn't for a malfunction, it was for an impossible reading. For a period of 4 seconds at 23:47 station time, sensor S284 had registered a temperature of negative 273.1 degrees Celsius. He stared, his coffee forgotten. It wasn't just cold, it was fundamentally wrong. Negative 273.15 degrees Celsius is absolute zero, the theoretical point at which all atomic motion ceases, a temperature that was physically impossible to reach. And this was just shy of it. He checked the surrounding sensors, S283, S285, and S298, the closest units, all read a steady minus 48 degrees Celsius, perfectly normal for the blizzard conditions. It had to be a glitch, a catastrophic failure of the thermocouple. Yet the sensor's diagnostic report, which ran automatically alongside every reading, came back green, all systems nominal. He pulled up the corresponding wind speed data for S284. For that same 4-second window, the anemometer, which had been registering gusts of over 60 miles per hour, flatlined. 0. A perfect absolute calm in the heart of a blizzard. And then just as suddenly, both temperature and wind speed returned to normal, matching the surrounding grid. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes. It was a ghost in the machine. A beautiful, baffling, but ultimately explainable ghost. He had seen strange sensor readings before. Ice buildup, magnetic interference, software bugs. This was just a more dramatic version. He opened his digital logbook. 2355. Note. Anomaly at S284. Registered near absolute zero temperature and zero wind speed for 4S. Diagnostics show no error. Probable cascading failure in the sensor's logic board due to extreme cold stress. Flagging for remote diagnostic sweep tomorrow. Data point quarantined. He saved the entry and shut down the log. The red alert on the main screen had already vanished, replaced by the calming uniform green. Outside, the wind howled its mindless song. Inside, the hum of the heaters was a reassuring promise of warmth and safety. Aris dismissed the anomaly from his mind. It was an outlier, a single faulty data point in a sea of predictable truth. In his pristine laboratory, there was no room for the impossible. He finished his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest, and felt utterly and completely alone and in control.
3 nights later, the blizzard had passed, leaving a world of sculpted ice and profound silence under a sky littered with cold and different stars. Aris was in the middle of calibrating the station's satellite link, a tedious but necessary task. The connection to the outside world was a lifeline, but one with a frustrating 24-hour delay on data packets and a near unusable latency for voice communication. He was compiling a weekly status report for Sarah Carter at the university, a string of data files and a short text message confirming all systems were green. Then, it happened again. An alert pinged, soft but insistent. He glanced at the main console. It wasn't S284 this time. It was S219, a full 10 miles southwest of the first anomaly and significantly closer to the station. He felt a prickle of unease. The data was identical to the first event, a 4-second plunge to negative 273.1 degrees Celsius, a simultaneous drop in wind speed to absolute zero, and then a seamless return to the ambient negative 52 degrees Celsius. The diagnostics, once again, reported a perfectly functioning sensor. One faulty sensor was an annoyance. 2, with the exact same impossible reading, was a pattern. His scientific curiosity piqued. Aris abandoned his report to Sarah. He spent the next hour running every remote diagnostic he had on both S284 and S219. He overloaded their processors, queried their memory, and tested their power cells. Every result came back flawless. It was like trying to find a scratch on a perfect pane of glass. He sent a heavily compressed data packet to Sarah, containing the 2 anomalous readings. His message was brief and clinical. Sarah, seeing a recurring sensor phenomenon. See attached. 2 separate sensors, days apart, same impossible reading.
running deep-level diagnostics, but initial results show no hardware failure. Thoughts? Perhaps an undocumented atmospheric lensing effect or a focused magnetic field anomaly from a subglacial iron deposit. The next night, it happened again. S-157. Closer still. The night after that, S-112. Now, it was less than 15 miles away. Aris felt the first cold tendrils of genuine fear. This wasn't random. He plotted the locations of the anomalies on a topographical map. A cold dread washed over him as he drew a line through the points. S-284, S-219, S-157, S-112. It was a trajectory. A slow, deliberate, and impossibly straight line, and its destination was the Polaris North Station. Even more disturbing was its movement relative to the environment. The prevailing wind, a constant river of frigid air, flowed from the southwest to the northeast. This thing was moving against it. It defied all known meteorological or geological principles. The delayed response from Sarah finally arrived. Her message, filtered through the logic of a world 1,000 miles away, felt hollow and inadequate. Sarah, data received. Bizarre. Engineering agrees it's likely not sensor failure. The readings are too specific. Top theory here is a form of uncatalogued cryovolcanic venting, a hyper-concentrated jet of supercooled gas escaping from the deep crust. That could explain localized temperature drop. We're running models, stay safe, keep collecting data. Cryovolcanic venting. It sounded scientific. It sounded logical, but it didn't explain the movement against the wind. It didn't explain the perfection of the data. And it didn't explain the other thing he had noticed. The station was equipped with an array of sensitive acoustic sensors, powerful enough to detect the groan and crack of ice sheets miles away. He had cross-referenced the timestamps of the anomalies with the acoustic logs. During each 4-second event, the world around that specific sensor didn't just get cold, it went utterly silent. The howling wind, the distant crunch of shifting ice, all of it vanished from the record. It wasn't just a lack of sound, it was the acoustic equivalent of a black hole, a perfect, profound cone of silence that emanated from the exact same point as the absolute cold. The entity didn't just absorb heat, it absorbed sound. Aris stood before the map, the straight line of the anomaly's path, a stark accusation against his orderly world. He was a man of science, a believer in measurable, logical explanations, but the thing moving toward him through the endless dark felt neither logical nor measurable. It felt ancient, predatory, and utterly alien. He was no longer just collecting data. He was tracking an intruder, and it was getting closer every night.
The waiting became a torture. Aris found himself unable to sleep, his life dictated by the 60-second refresh of the sensor grid. He watched as the anomaly, this moving pocket of impossible cold, jumped from sensor to sensor, night after night, drawing an unerring line toward him. S98, S64, S31. Each new alert was a tolling bell marking its approach. He tried to reason with himself, running Sarah's cryovolcano theory through simulations, but the numbers never worked. A gas jet would be dispersed by the wind. It wouldn't create a moving point of perfect stillness. Then came the night he knew it would arrive. The last sensor on its trajectory, S04, just a mile from the station, had not registered an anomaly. He had watched it for hours, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. But the anomaly hadn't appeared there. It had simply vanished from the grid. For a moment, a wild, foolish hope surged through him. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had dissipated. The hope was shattered by the piercing shriek of the station's own alarms. He scrabbled from his chair, his blood turning to ice water. It wasn't a remote sensor flashing red. It was the station itself. The main console was a riot of crimson warnings. External hull temperature, catastrophic low. Life support, heating system overload, structural integrity warning, thermal stress. He stumbled to the monitor displaying the station's exterior schematic. On the northeast-facing wall, the side directly in the anomaly's path, a section of the hull was colored deep impossible blue. The external temperature reading for that specific spot was plummeting, minus 80 degrees Celsius, minus 120 degrees, minus 200 degrees. It was far, far colder than the already brutal Arctic air outside. It was happening. It was here. Driven by a morbid, terrified compulsion, Aris ran to the reinforced porthole window in the main living module, the very window that faced the direction of the anomaly's approach. The thick, triple-paned plexiglass was designed to withstand a charging polar bear, to insulate against the deadliest cold on Earth. As he stared into the absolute blackness of the polar night, he saw it. He saw nothing, no shape, no monster, no light, but on the external surface of the window, a frost was blooming. It didn't creep in from the edges like normal frost. It erupted from the center, spreading with an unnatural, terrifying speed. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a world being born and dying in seconds. The patterns weren't the familiar, feathery, six-sided shapes of snowflakes. These were different. They were alien. Complex, mesmerizing spirals unfurled like frozen galaxies. Crystalline veins branched out, not like the limbs of a tree, but like the vessels of some strange circulatory system. It was horrifically beautiful, a glimpse into a form of physics that had no business existing. It was as if a colossal, unseen giant had pressed its mouth to the window and exhaled, leaving a breathmark of absolute zero. The alarms wailed, a symphony of technological panic. The inner wall of the station, feet from where he stood, became painfully cold to the touch. He could feel the chill radiating into the room, a palpable wave of cold that had nothing to do with the ambient air temperature. It was a deep, penetrating, bone-aching cold that felt like it was leaching the very life force from him. The steady, comforting hum of the station's life support system changed pitch, straining into a high-pitched whine. The heating elements, working at maximum capacity, were fighting a losing battle against a foe they were never designed for. Red lights flashed on the environmental control panel, indicating that the system was shunting all available power to the heaters, trying desperately to maintain the station's internal temperature. Aris backed away from the window, his own breath misting in the air of the climate-controlled room. The frost had now completely covered the porthole, a beautiful, terrifying mosaic that blocked out the dark world outside. But the horror was no longer outside. The cold was pressing in, testing the limits of his sanctuary. He felt a profound, primal dread settle in his soul. This thing, this breath, wasn't just passing by. It was examining his home. It was tasting the warmth. And now, it knew exactly where he was. Panic set in, cold and sharp. The entity was outside, its impossible cold pressing against the hull, and every rational explanation Aris has clung to had shattered. Sarah's emails about cryovolcanoes now seemed like children's stories. He was a man of science, and his science was failing him. Desperate for answers, for anything that might give him a foothold, he turned his search inward, to the station's archives. He needed to know if this had happened before. The official station logs were meticulously maintained, spanning 2 decades of research. He cross-referenced past winter-over periods with astronomical charts and weather data, searching for any similar anomalies. Nothing. The records were clean, filled with routine maintenance reports, data uploads, and the occasional note about a failing water pump. But there was another archive, buried deep in the server, password protected and not part of the standard university-mandated system, the personal logs of previous researchers. Most were mundane, digital diaries of loneliness, boredom, and the sublime beauty of the Arctic. Then he found the files from Dr. Alistair Finch, who had wintered over alone a decade ago. The official report on Finch was brief. A brilliant but troubled man who died tragically due to a catastrophic life support malfunction complicated by self-inflicted exposure to the elements. His death was ruled an accident. Aris bypassed the encryption with the systems administrator backdoor code. Finch's official logs were as sterile as all the others, but in a corrupted hidden folder labeled My Own Damn Truth, he found it. A series of audio and text files that chronicled a man's descent into utter terror. The first few entries were normal, filled with scientific observations and complaints about the freeze-dried food. Then the tone shifted. Log entry 74. Another sensor glitch tonight. Bizarre. Out on the eastern grid. Temp dropped off the charts for a second. Must be the magnetic interference from that subglacial ridge. Still unsettling. Aris's blood ran cold. He scrolled forward. Log entry 81. It's not interference. It happened again, closer this time. It's moving, against the wind. This breaks everything, all the rules. I must be going mad. The isolation must be getting to me. I haven't heard a human voice in 3 months. The next entry was an audio file. Finch's voice was strained, high-pitched with the fear he was trying to suppress with scientific jargon. It's a moving pocket of pure entropy. That's the only way to describe it. It doesn't just make things cold. It removes energy. All of it. Thermal, kinetic, even acoustic. The silence. God, the silence around it is the worst part. I've started calling it the breath. It feels like the world holding its breath before it dies. Aris felt a shock of recognition so profound it made him dizzy. The breath. Finch had seen it. He had understood. He frantically opened the next file, a text entry. Log entry 92. It's at the station. It touched the outer hull last night. The frost. It's not natural. It's like a living fractal. I think it's an elemental. Not a creature of flesh or matter, but something more fundamental. A being of pure cold, of absolute null. Our world is a cacophony of heat and life and motion. To wit, we must be like a roaring fire in a silent, dark room. It's not evil. I don't think it has a concept of morality. It's just drawn to the noise, to the warmth, and its touch extinguishes us. Finch's theories were insane, the ramblings of a man pushed to the brink by isolation, but they fit the facts better than any cryovolcano. Aris's hands were trembling as he clicked on the final file. It was a corrupted audio log, filled with static and the sound of chattering teeth, but Finch's words were clear enough, a frantic, terrified whisper. It's not just outside anymore. It found a way in. The vent, the condensation reclamation system, it's a closed loop, but there's always moisture. It can travel on moisture, on the tiniest temperature gradient. It's in the walls. I can feel it, the cold. It's not just in the air, it's inside me. Sometimes I can feel its cold breath on my. The recording ended there. A sudden burst of static, then silence. Aris stumbled back from the console, a gasp caught in his throat. The official report said Finch died of exposure after a station malfunction, but Aris now knew the truth. The station hadn't malfunctioned. It had been compromised. And Finch hadn't wandered outside to his death. The cold had come inside for him. The horror was no longer a siege from without. The walls of his sanctuary were meaningless. The monster was already in the house. The knowledge from Finch's logs changed everything. The Polaris North Station, once his high-tech fortress, now felt like a tomb. The solid, reassuring hum of the machinery was no longer a comfort. It was a network of potential highways for an entity that could ride on moisture and temperature gradients. Every surface held a new menace. Aris became a man possessed by a new, terrifying obsession. He walked the corridors not as a scientist, but as a ghost hunter. The air vents in his sleeping quarters, once a source of filtered warmth, now seemed like a gaping mouth. He sealed it with industrial-grade duct tape, his breath fogging in the rapidly cooling air. The water reclamation unit, a miracle of engineering that recycled every drop of moisture, was now the station's circulatory system for the entity. He stared at the condensation beating on the pipes in the engineering module. each droplet a potential vessel for the absolute cold. Was it already in the water? Was he drinking it? His scientific mind, trained to observe and analyze, turned inward, cataloging his own paranoia. He knew the psychological effects of prolonged isolation and darkness could include hallucinations and heightened anxiety. Was he just succumbing to the pressure, driven mad by Finch's story? He tried to cling to that possibility, that his terror was a product of his own mind. Then he felt it. He was in the narrow corridor leading to the storage pod, his back to the main living area. A faint, icy puff of air touched the back of his neck. It was no stronger than a whisper, but it was impossibly, unnaturally cold. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The corridor was empty. The thermal controls for that section were green. No vents were active. He checked the temperature sensor on his wrist-mounted tablet. 19 degrees Celsius, a perfectly comfortable room temperature. But the cold he'd felt was real. It was a phantom, a ghost of a sensation, but it had been there. It was the phantom breath. The occurrences became more frequent, more insidious. He would be working at the console and feel a sudden passing coldness brush by his leg, as if a small invisible animal had slunk past him. One moment, his own breath was invisible in the warm, recycled air. The next, it would fog for a single, shocking second, a plume of white vapor in a room where it had no right to exist. He would enter a module and feel an inexplicable cold spot in the center of the room, a spot that would dissipate moments later, leaving him trembling and questioning his sanity. The station itself seemed to be turning against him. The technology, his shield and his tool, was being subtly compromised. The heating in the storage pod, a place he rarely went, would suddenly switch to maximum, while the heating in his sleeping quarters would shut down without explanation, forcing him to reboot the entire environmental system. The water reclamation unit went into overdrive one night, its pumps working furiously for no reason, filling the engineering module with a thick, cloying humidity, a perfect breeding ground for the entity. It was intelligent. Finch was right. It wasn't just drawn to the station's warmth. It was learning. It was manipulating the systems, not breaking them, but nudging them, creating an environment more hospitable for itself. The horror had shifted from a monstrous external force to an intimate, invasive presence. It was in the walls, in the water, in the air he breathed. Aris Thorne was no longer alone in the Polaris North Station. He was sharing his cage with something ancient, silent, and utterly, malevolently cold. The entity's presence graduated from subtle intrusions to active, intelligent malice. It was no longer just exploring its new environment. It was studying its sole occupant. It was learning him. The game had changed. This was no longer a haunting. It was a hunt. The cold spots were no longer random. They began to appear with chilling prescience. He would decide to go to the kitchen module for a ration pack, and as he reached the corridor, he would feel the telltale wave of unnatural cold seep out from under the door, a silent warning that it was waiting for him. He would prepare to settle into his bunk for a few hours of fitful, terrified sleep, and the phantom breath would caress his cheek just as he closed his eyes, a mocking kiss of absolute zero. The entity was anticipating his movements, using his own routines against him. The psychological toll was immense. Every decision, every step was fraught with a new layer of dread. The station, his entire world, had been reduced to 3 small, interconnected rooms, and yet there was nowhere to hide. One evening, he was reviewing sensor data, trying to force his mind back into the familiar comfort of scientific analysis. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the engineering pod. He grabbed a heavy wrench, his knuckles white, and crept down the corridor. Inside, he found the source. A thick coolant pipe for the main generator had developed a hairline fracture,
and a fine, supercooled mist was spraying into the air, instantly freezing on the floor in a slick, treacherous patch of ice. The pipe's pressure gauge was in the red. It should have triggered a dozen alarms, but the system was silent. The entity had not only created a physical hazard, but had also blinded him to it. It was learning to sever his connection to his own technology. It was during this slow, methodical dismantling of his sanity and his safety that the ultimate, soul-crushing realization dawned on him. He looked at the thermal map of the surrounding 50 miles. The station was a blazing beacon of heat, a bonfire of life and energy in a landscape defined by its absolute absence. For hundreds of miles in every direction, there was nothing. No animals, no geothermal vents, nothing. Just ice, rock, and the silent, hungry cold. He was the only source of warmth. He was the only spark of complex life. He was the only noise in its silent, frozen world. The station was just the lure. He was the prize. It was coming for him. With a final, desperate surge of clarity, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't just survive. He couldn't let this thing win. And more importantly, he couldn't let it escape. If a rescue team came for him, would it learn to follow them back? Could it attach itself to a ship, a vehicle, a person, and be carried back to a world teeming with warmth and life? The thought was more terrifying than his own death. He sat at the communications console, his fingers shaking, but his resolve was firm. He composed one last data packet for Sarah. There would be no more talk of cryovolcanoes or magnetic fields. He attached Finch's hidden logs, his own frantic notes, and a short, desperate message. "Sarah," he typed, "Finch was right. It's an entity. It's inside the station. It's intelligent. I am the target. Do not, under any circumstances, send a rescue team to Polaris North. Mark this entire sector as a quarantine zone. The official story must be a reactor failure, an explosion. Nothing left to recover. I am going to try to destroy it, to fight it. It's the only way to be sure, the only way to protect everything else. Goodbye." He hit send, watching the progress bar crawl as the message was beamed toward a satellite, a final, hopeless prayer sent out into the void. Then he severed the connection, cutting himself off from the world for good. The hunt was on, and he was the bait. But he would not be easy prey. He would make his last stand not just for his own life, but for the warm, noisy world that had no idea what was breathing in the dark.
The entity's response to his final message was immediate and decisive. It was as if severing the satellite link was a declaration of war. The main power grid didn't just fail, it was murdered. The reassuring hum of the station died with a choked gasp, plunging the entire facility into a terrifying, profound darkness, broken only by the hellish crimson glow of the emergency backup lights. Simultaneously, the temperature everywhere began to plummet. It wasn't a gradual cooling. It was an aggressive, active assault. The last vestiges of warmth were being systematically devoured. Aris could feel the killing cold coalescing in the main living area with him. It was no longer a series of fleeting sensations, but a constant, crushing presence. The hunt was over. This was the kill. He could see the alien frost patterns, the spiraling biological veins, spreading across the inside of the porthole windows now, creeping across the very consoles he had once commanded. The moisture from his own frantic breaths was being captured, turned into a weapon against him, painting the room in the entity's beautiful, deadly signature. But Aris had a plan, a desperate, suicidal, final gambit. He had spent the last few hours poring over Finch's corrupted notes and the station's engineering schematics. You couldn't fight absolute cold with more cold, or with walls, or with technology it could subvert. You had to fight it with its absolute opposite: intense, chaotic, uncontrolled heat. The Polaris North Station was powered by a small, volatile microturbine generator. It was a marvel of efficiency, but its core was inherently unstable if pushed beyond its limits. Finch's notes had hinted at it, a frantic scrawl about a fail-safe override that could trigger a thermal runaway. It was designed to prevent a catastrophic explosion, but Aris intended to do the opposite. He was going to intentionally overload the core. He was going to turn his sanctuary into a bomb. The climax began as a desperate race against his own freezing body. He needed to get from the central hub to the engineering module, a corridor of perhaps 50 feet that had become the most dangerous place on Earth. The cold was a physical weight, slowing his limbs, making his joints ache. His insulated coveralls felt as thin as paper. He pushed open the door to the corridor and was immediately thrown off balance. The entity had coated the floor in a perfectly smooth, impossibly slick sheet of black ice. He fell hard, the impact jarring his teeth. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw the control panel for the engineering pod door ahead of him. Even as he watched, a thick layer of the alien frost bloomed over its surface, freezing it solid. He wouldn't be able to open it electronically. With a roar of defiance, he charged, slamming his shoulder into the door. Pain shot through him, but the lock groaned. He hit it again and again, the rhythmic impacts a stark drumbeat against the overwhelming silence. The door burst open. The engineering module was an ice cave. Frost coated every surface, hanging from pipes like frozen moss. The air was so cold, it felt like breathing powdered glass. In the center of the room was the generator, its housing already covered in the entity's crystalline patterns. He staggered toward it, his vision starting to tunnel, the debilitating effects of extreme hypothermia setting in. He ripped open the generator's control panel, his frozen fingers fumbling with the latches. He ignored the standard controls and located the fail-safe shunt Finch had described. It required a physical key and a command line code. As he worked, he could feel the entity's presence focusing on him, a projection of overwhelming psychic cold that threatened to stop his heart. He felt his will to live being extinguished, replaced by a welcoming, peaceful desire to simply lie down and let the cold take him. "No," he snarled, his voice a ragged croak. He forced his thoughts to his purpose, to the image of this cold spreading to the world. With a final, agonizing effort, he turned the key and typed the override command. "Execute Thermal Runaway Protocol Omega." He hit enter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low hum started from within the generator, a sound that quickly escalated into a screaming, world-ending wail. The alarms, powered by the generator itself, blared back to life, their sound now a triumphant fanfare. The frost on the generator's housing didn't just melt, it sublimated, vanishing in an instant. The entity, a being of pure cold and entropy, reacted with what could only be described as a shriek of pure panic. The crushing cold in the room was violently repelled, thrown back by the immense, chaotic wave of raw heat erupting from the core. The station shuddered, the metal groaning as it was subjected to two opposing thermal extremes. Aris, already in his insulated emergency suit, didn't wait. He turned and ran, a final, desperate dash for the small, detached emergency airlock at the far end of the storage pod. Behind him, the generator's scream reached an impossible crescendo as the core began its catastrophic meltdown. He sealed the inner airlock door just as the world behind him dissolved into a silent, white-hot flash. The meltdown was not an explosion of sound and fury, but a silent, awesome release of pure energy. A wave of intense heat vaporized the Polaris North Station, the ice sheet beneath it, and presumably the elemental entity that had been trapped within. Aris, sealed in the tiny, coffin-like emergency airlock, felt only a violent shudder before being plunged into a cold, even more profound than the one he had just escaped. The natural, indifferent cold of the Arctic night. He was alive, left with nothing but an emergency beacon, a week's worth of rations, and the crushing, agoraphobic darkness of the polar landscape. Weeks later, a rescue team, alerted by the cessation of his station's automated weekly check-in, found him. He was frostbitten, emaciated, and severely traumatized, but alive. His official story was a testament to human endurance. A catastrophic failure of the station's experimental generator had led to a fire and meltdown, and he had miraculously survived. His final, frantic data packet to Sarah, with its talk of entities and quarantine zones, was dismissed as the corrupted files of a man suffering from extreme psychological distress due to prolonged isolation. A tragic but understandable breakdown. The data was quietly archived, labeled inconclusive. Months passed. Aris was back in civilization, a ghost haunting a world that was too loud, too bright, too warm. He tried to recover, to piece his life back together, but the cold had left a scar deep within his soul. He couldn't stand air conditioning. He kept his apartment heated to a sweltering, uncomfortable degree. Friends and colleagues found him distant, changed. He had a permanent, deep-seated chill that no furnace, no blanket, no human warmth could seem to touch. He eventually returned to work, finding a fragile solace in the familiar world of academia. The final scene finds him at a university podium a year after his rescue. He is delivering a lecture on atmospheric phenomena, his voice a bit hoarse, his movement stiff. He pauses, taking a sip of ice water from a glass provided for him on the lectern. He sets the glass down, the condensation beating on its side in the warm lecture hall. He continues speaking, his words about pressure systems and climate models flowing with practiced ease. The camera, however, does not follow him. It pushes in, focusing tightly on the glass of water he has just set down. As Aris's voice drones on, a single, beautiful, and utterly alien frost crystal begins to slowly, impossibly, form on the outside of the glass. It is not a normal speck of ice. It is a perfect, miniature spiral, like a frozen galaxy, blooming silently in the heat. Fade to black. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.